Hello all, Happy New Year. This is the first episode of 2021. I started off my 2021 by issuing myself a book a day challenge. And the challenge was basically to see if I can read a book a day, or at least if it's a very long book, in 2 days. So far since what day is it? Let's see. 5 days ago. In 5 days, I have read 4 books. Supernatural by Graham Hancock, Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock, The Immortality Key by Brian. I'm going to destroy his last name, so I'm not going to try. And Your Brain is a Time Machine by Dean. I'm not going to try his last name either, but if you are interested in any of these books, I would suggest that you Google just the titles and you should see them pop up. I wanted to make this episode a discussion of those 4 books, sort of like a Cliff Notes version, and trying to kind of tie them all in together. I do wonder, though, if the last book, Is Your Brain a Time Machine, really will blend in with the rest of these episodes, or with the rest of the other books, only because Is Your Brain a Time Machine, or Your Brain is a Time Machine, rather. What that does is it delves more with time and space and physics and all of that. And then the other 3 kind of look more through like the supernatural and history and alternative history and things of that nature. So I'm going to start off by focusing on at least the first 3. Immortality Key, Fingerprints of the Gods, and Supernatural. I'll start with Supernatural because that's what I started with first. And I got on that kick because one of my friends kind of popped up out of the blue, said they were reading Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. And I thought, wait, that name sounds familiar. I searched my library and saw that I did, in fact, have one of Graham Hancock's books in my library. And so I decided, well, let's just give it a listen. Supernatural is a very interesting book because it starts off historically. It talks about art and cave paintings and ancient sculptures. And so it paints this, image of, the ancients would go into these caves and then they would have a kind of like a psychedelic experience. And then in these caves, they would sculpt things that they saw or draw on in the caves, things that they saw in their vision quests or in their, while they were under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs. And that was his theory as to how these sort of cave paintings came to be. Then it sort of veered in the middle to alien abductions, and he combined alien abductions and stories of alien abductions to people in early history in Europe, just throughout time, really, and their accounts of fairies, elves, as well as hybrid babies and human babies being kidnapped by fairies and elves in order to form hybrid babies. So it's a bit wild, but I try to read these sort of things with an open mind, only because when you encounter things that you have never really thought about before, at least not on your own, it does help. It's an exercise in expanding the mind. So when I hear these sort of things, I don't roll my eyes and say, okay, that's crazy. I pause and understand that, there's things in this world that I don't know everything. And if he has experienced or toured or read enough or discussed these sort of concepts with enough people, where he's able to now come to these sort of conclusions or sort of, unabashedly write about this stuff, I will listen with an open mind. I'm not saying I necessarily believe in everything that he's presenting. I don't. But there were interesting topics and ideas that he did present. Now, after that whole thing, he goes in to talk about the DNA, human DNA, and he mentions a Zipf mystery, which is ZIPF. And I would recommend that you sort of Google that and read about it. Zipf's law in itself is a little unnerving. But to me, it hints to the fact that perhaps we are, in fact, living in a sort of a simulation. And I guess I should read what Zipf's law is for you. So let me go ahead and Google it and read it out. I should have done that earlier. 1 second. Elevator music. Zipf's law. Okay. All right. So Zipf's law is an empirical law formulated using mathematical statistics, named after George Kingsley Zipf, who first proposed it. Zipf's law states that given a large sample of words used, the frequency of any word is inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency table. So that whole concept is sort of mysterious, because you could take a book, a novel, and analyze it, and they will always fall under this sort of law. The frequency of each word is close to inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency table. And he used that to describe what was happening in so-called junk DNA. And he found that, or he says that he found that, or not he particularly, but he talked to scientists who found that our junk DNA also operates under Zipf's law, falls under Zipf's law, in the same way as like a novel will. Like if you take a novel and you scan through the novel, it will fall under Zipf's law. So I thought that was like kind of wild. Then he talked about how some Virgin Mary sightings are actually UFO phenomenon co-opted by the church. So there were certain places where people actually saw, I guess they called them fairies and elves and things of that nature. Small, ethereal looking creatures with, pale skin and hair. And they performed miracles. And then later on, the Catholic Church kind of took over those places and claimed that these entities that people mentioned seeing was actually the Virgin Mary. So that was an interesting tidbit. Then he moved on back to hallucinogens, and he talked about how Moses was a shaman who was under the influence possibly of an ayahuasca type of psychedelic or similar sort of drug that caused him to experience the encounter with the burning bush. Then he kind of delves into the fact that, or the theory rather, that hallucinogens are actually the foundation of most ancient religions. So it's a lot of stuff going on in the book. And if you are into that kind of stuff or you're interested in that, check it out. Now, there was one theory specifically that he mentioned that was it was about panspermia. I forget what scientist he said sort of wrote about it. I wrote it somewhere. Actually, you know what? It's always worth taking the time to find the information. So bear with me. Once again, elevator music. I believe it was Crick. There we go. Crick, who discovered DNA, or one of the scientists who discovered DNA, wrote a book on panspermia. He basically said that the way that our DNA is structured and coded, there's no way that this happened by accident, which essentially lent itself to the concept of intelligent design being at the very least probable. But because he was an atheist, he decided instead to write a book called Life Itself, Its Origin and Nature. That's Francis Crick. And he claims in that book that life actually was formed on another planet and then came here. So, like, essentially, the concept of panspermia. So DNA, the code that we have right now has, was the same DNA coding, just with different different formulas, I guess. Just like in a color wheel, we have three primary colors, right? Red, yellow, blue. And from those three colors, all the colors that humanity can perceive exist, right? That's basically the same thing with DNA. That concept stuck with me. The whole, we could possibly have been like planted, like our DNA possibly could have been planted by like an alien species from, another galaxy, and then like Earth being perhaps a type of ark, like a Noah's Ark in itself, with containing species of a lost civilization, etc., etc. So I thought that concept was interesting, and so I hoped to be able to find out some more information on that topic, and I hoped, or I at least assumed, that he would delve into it deeper in the books, in the following book that I read called Fingerprints of the Gods. Now, in Fingerprints of the Gods, that was not necessarily the case. Fingerprints of the God started off talking about the Piri Reis map. And if you don't know what the Piri Reis map is, it's basically a map that was discovered in a library in Constantinople. It shows features of the Earth that nobody in 1513 should have known, including Antarctica, before Antarctica was discovered by modern man anyway, or modern civilization. And I put modern in quotes. He also mentions other ancient maps that depict Antarctica, and that predate the discovery of Antarctica by Western minds, by Western civilization, modern Western civilization. And he more or less starts off alluding to the theory that these maps may have referenced world surveys created by a lost, technologically advanced ancient civilization. So right away I'm reading that and I'm like, this sounds kind of like Atlantis, right? Like he's leading to the conclusion that Atlantis is real. And that's basically how it ended. But in between the beginning and the end, there's a lot of references and a lot of information. So he talks about the Mayans, and he talks about like the Olmec heads. He talks about the correlation between the ancient Egyptians, the Mayans, and the Sumerians, and how there was a lot of similarities between like their art and their gods and their practices and things of that nature as well. And the Olmec heads having African features, he did a great job of breaking that down. It showed that there was an African presence there, and not as slaves, like we've been programmed to just equate African to slaves. But the presence of the Olmec head, and the way he says it, he breaks it down. He says there's no way like somebody just conceptualizes the concept of African people, or these are, in his words, Negroid features, and you clearly needed a reference to be able to sculpt these. And I know, because I am an artist and a sculptor as well. Sculptor as of 2021, this is my new thing. But anyway, so yeah, you do need references, and if you've never encountered a particular ethnicity before, you don't just pull that ethnicity out of your ass, right? You need a point of reference. And there's so many Olmec heads that should tell you that these people, these African people with Negroid features, existed in the Americas way, like thousands of years prior to America's quote discovery by you know who. I thought that was interesting. If you haven't heard of the Olmec heads, I suggest just go on Google and type in Olmec head statues, because that's definitely super cool to see. He also discusses this concept called the hypothetical third-party theory, basically saying that there must have been a more technological advanced civilization that came to Earth, a third party, and essentially civilized mankind rather. He describes mankind as a species with amnesia, and then he delves into talk about the concept of the Great Deluge, or otherwise known as the Great Flood. Now that's interesting. That was interesting to me because he brings up the fact of that across different, civilizations, there's this recurring story across cultures. There's this recurring story of the flood myth, right? The Great Flood, where mankind gets wiped out and having to start over. And that to me was brow raising, right? Why is this like their consistent thing, right? Throughout all these cultures that otherwise don't interact with each other, they all have this myth, this story, this understanding, this belief that there was once upon a time in history, a time when a flood happened and sort of wiped out all of civilization, in which mankind had to start over from the beginning. Most civilizations, if not all civilizations, also have a concept, a belief, an underlying belief in the idea of gods, right? Of entities that look human but are somehow much more advanced, right? And there's this quote that says, science is indistinguishable from magic at a certain point. Yeah? So perhaps what these ancient cultures took to be, magic of the gods were actually more of a technological display from this, quote, third party of civilizers that essentially, what he says, emerged after the flood to civilize man. And he ends the story by saying that as we move into the great thawing that's occurring now, climate change, you'll start to see Antarctica will melt, and then we will start finding evidence of a technologically advanced civilization in Antarctica. And he said that they are basically that was basically where Atlantis was based. And so he concludes that Thoth, which is Hermes, the Greek's Hermes, Ra, Isis, Osiris, the Mayans, Quetzalcoatl, these were all actually like technologically advanced humans, like human beings who were Atlanteans. And and somehow there was a drastic, like a great deluge, a drastic climate change, the ice age, or a great thaw, something happened that caused Atlantis to fall. And these entities that all these cultures write about or perceive as gods were actually just technologically advanced humans who sort of traveled through the rest of the earth, that wasn't either frozen or flooded. However, whatever the tragedy was, or the catastrophic event was, they were the ones who were able to escape from Atlantis as it was destroyed, and then travel through the rest of the world to sort of teach the rest of humanity what they knew, right? That to me was pretty dope. Oh, and then he says that there is another impending cataclysm that's coming for us in about 2030. So I didn't like that part. But going back to the concept of gods and Atlantis and etc., I like that idea. I don't find it to be that far-fetched, only because of this. Right now on Earth, there are civilizations that are existing at different rates of, technological advancement, right? Like we have, you go to Japan and everything's sort of cool and robotic. Singapore is like super advanced, and Asia in general, like their trains are super fast. And then you have, the West, and we're advanced too, but relatively, I feel like in Asia they're really kind of on top of things there. But then you draw comparisons to all still in 2021, there are civilizations of people who still are living like in like it's 1500s, 1600s. Like they don't have running water, they don't have electricity, they don't know about cell phones, right? You can even think of people who are like, these untouched tribes in the Amazonian rainforest that have never sort of interacted with anyone outside of their civilization. So right now, concurrently, all of this is existing right now. All of this is existing simultaneously right now. Different civilizations, different cultures, different countries, different groups of peoples who are at variant points of civilization. So if something like the movie 2012 basically showed like the magnetic fields of the earth shifted, and that caused like everything that was like north of the equator to like just be like completely messed up, and then so humanity had to move like to like south of the equator, right? So if something like that were to happen now, right, like it's a mass flooding, like there's just a gigantic shift in weather and temperature, like all of the stuff that we have right now would be completely gone. And then the few of us who are for some reason able to get away from here, or the people who just happen to be existing right now in those areas, they will survive, right? But let's say you're an American scientist and you are able to see this coming, and you're able to get on some sort of ship or series of ships or subs or whatever it is, whatever technology that will allow you to escape from this hemisphere to a hemisphere that's unaffected, right? And now you encounter people like in, the deserts or whatever of Africa, or the forests of whatever. You would bring them the civilization, what you have learned from your culture, you would bring it to them. And if they had never interacted with your culture before, and these are just farmers or whatever, to them a cell phone, an iPad, whatever else our government is capable of right now that the rest of us aren't aware of, right? Whatever it is that we have access to that they don't, and they were largely superstitious, you would be treated as a god. Right? So to me, it's not that far-fetched. Fingerprints of the Gods wasn't quite as far-fetched or hard to believe as perhaps Supernatural, which Supernatural more talked about, aliens and drugs and hallucinogens. Not that I'm put off by those topics, I'm not. But I like the historical sort of theorizing of, of like perhaps what the ancients thought to be gods were actually people who were escaping like a much more technologically advanced, like let's say Antarctica, before, an ice age, right? They got up, while it was happening or whatever, and brought with them some technology. Because what you'll read about is when they discuss the gods, it's like the gods always, in all these different cultures, they always seem to have, like human, abilities, in the sense of like they do age, they get sick, they can mate with, humans. So to me, if a god can mate with humans, then they're probably also humans, right? Like it's a cross. It's not like they're, cross species. They're the same species because they're able to mate and produce offspring. So these sort of stories, recurring tales of, gods, quote, gods mating with humankind or human beings, just tells me that, okay, they have to be of the same species. And we've seen it time and time again, even like in movies or TV shows like Star Trek. Oftentimes when a significantly more technologically advanced civilization interacts with one that is less so, the less advanced culture always kind of looks to them like in worship, right, as some sort of gods, right, because their minds just can't, like, for the most part, like, even deal with that, with this something. When you're, farming, you don't have electricity, a television, if you've never seen a television seems like a miracle. So there's a cell phone, so that to me was interesting. Not that I didn't like what Hancock discussed in Supernatural. I just found personally, this story, Fingerprints of Gods, to be intriguing. A couple of times he did mention that 2012 and Mayan prophecy and all of that, but overall it was an interesting read. I would say if you have any interest in in alien encounters and linking them to mythology, and I guess I could probably approach the same sort of approach Supernatural with the same sort of open-mindedness discussion that I just did with Fingerprints of the Gods. If that is your thing and you're into, like, okay, could there be a correlation between fairies and aliens, right? Alien sightings. Then I wouldn't say, like, don't read that. Like, it is interesting. The one thing about Supernatural that was sort of weird to me was the fact that there was this recurrent theme of the aliens / elves or whatever continuously wanting to sort of forcibly impregnate, for lack of better phrasing, human females. They were trying to, it was forced pregnancies, and they were trying to make hybrid humans. Like that seemed like, of all the people that they interviewed, even in modern times, it kind of recounted stories of alien abductions. It seems like these entities were consistently trying to create hybrids with humans. Now, that led me to theorize that perhaps aliens, elves, basically what we understand as a spiritual entity are actually like non-corporeal parasites that essentially feed on humanity's psychic abilities to manifest like whatever realities that we want, or shift through realities. There's something to be said about having a body, right? Consistently, these entities that possess people or kidnap people, when people tell the stories of abductions, it seems like these abductions are occurring on a spiritual level, right? They have implants that are put into their bodies, but then when they are examined, those implants are gone or missing or aren't present at all. And when you talk to these individuals, they swear, no, like this really happened. So my thing is there like, do human beings, obviously we do, but I'll finish the question. Do human beings have a non-corporeal form as well that can also be manipulated, right? And then is there something to the fact that because we also have corporeal form, corporeal basically meaning tangible, like your body, like your corpse, right? These entities want to sort of become more like us, to be able to manipulate reality. And could this be why they are abducting women and like making pregnancies? That to me is wild. Like it's almost like it pushes your barrier of perception, because there are people who genuinely, like, not just regular people, scientists who write about this stuff, historians who write about this stuff and theorize about what all this mean. So not to be, dismissed at all, but to be considered. Why is it that this recurrent stories, even there was a book on DMT, I think it's called DMT, the spirit molecule, and there was a scientist who was in a lab setting injecting his patients with DMT. And a lot of them also reported the same thing when they came to, that they were interacting with entities that wanted to implant things into their bodies. They swore up and down that they had things implanted into their bodies, but upon further examination, nothing came of it. And then there were women who would talk about, hybrid babies and things like that. What is that about? So when I see something that kind of keeps recurring, it kind of makes me want to examine that closely, and then theorize as to, let's just say there is a spiritual realm. Obviously, if you believe that you are not just your body and you have a consciousness or a spirit or a soul, then you also have to believe that there's got to be, a non-formative world, right? If you believe that you're not a body, that you have a body, that you're a spirit who has a body, and then you are in a corporeal world, then you also have to kind of accept the fact that there should be a non-corporeal world that we, for some reason or another, seem to be incapable of accessing, unless through chemicals like DMT or ayahuasca or quote magic mushrooms, or even fasting in caves. I'm actually going to delve into that when I talk about the Immortality Key, where he breaks that down to the origins of religion, and see if I can blend everything together. But that to me tells me, it's like, it seems like in Graham Hancock mentioned in Supernatural, in Fingerprints of the Gods, that humanity seems to be suffering from some sort of a form of amnesia. And it does seem like there's a lot happening to us in this world that we seem to not know a lot about, even though we should. And one of the things is, an understanding of what is out there, what this quote, what we call spiritual world. Is the word spiritual just another word for, like if you watch Star Trek, they frequently encounter what are labeled non-corporeal entities, which are essentially just entities that have evolved beyond needing bodies. And we, humanity, we are dual entities, so we have bodies, we aren't the bodies. And perhaps there are non-corporeal entities that want bodies, and they, either are trying to reverse engineer or devolve, because once you reach a point in evolution where you exist without a body, perhaps the inability to feel things after a while sort of gets to you, and you sort of want that. You get addicted to those feelings again. So now they're trying to scientifically figure out how to do that. Several topics in science fiction explore this. One, right now I can see it has, I think his name is Peter Jackson. It's called Fringe. And they kind of showed that, but it was a physical slant. It showed that like 100 years or whatever, 300 years in the future, mankind, quote, evolves to a place where they no longer have like sex there. There are no females. They just kind of grow everybody in the tube, but they also don't have emotions. And then they come back into our time, because there's something kind of missing in their lives, right? Like there's no music, there's no art, there are no women, no color, no passion, and all of that. And so, they kind of travel back in time to exist in our time so that they can experience things that humanity as a whole had, quote, evolved past. So evolution doesn't necessarily involve something that's linear. And another example that pops into mind is an old Star Trek episode that I watched. I think it was the original series, where it was the same thing. There were they used to be human, or at least humanoid. They had evolved past needing the bodies, but then they started possessing human beings because they wanted the body, they wanted the sensation, feeling. They so they went about it kind of a messed up way or whatever. And I'm wondering if the psyches of the writers who are writing these sort of stories aren't perceiving something, that might be, where you might be oblivious to it. So I find that whole topic to be interesting. But yeah, if we can have a corporeal realm, which is what Earth is, then why can we also not have simultaneously a spiritual realm? So I'm looking at my notes right now, and other things he talked about in in Supernatural, he talked about ayahuasca, the plant, having a spirit, and like when people consume ayahuasca, it takes them to like a land of like plant people. And like that's interesting to me, as well. Like is the drug like a sort of portal that allows your non-corporeal self, like the non-corporeal, your spiritual body, to travel to these like alternate non-corporeal, like quote, spiritual realms, right? And they say, it's said in that book, Supernatural, that these plant beings were sort of, quote, gods. We tend to kind of assign that label to anything that's like, greater than human standard, right? We even do this to like human beings that are alive now. Like some people have called, like great athletes, like, oh, that's a god, or like a woman who's like supremely beautiful, we call them like, oh, that's a goddess. And I just seem like this is just something that we intrinsically do. We elevate to godhood human beings that are just like, slightly above or above base level standard actions or looks or performance or anything like that. But looking over my notes, plant beings, gods teaching you things encountered by entranced or drug and influenced individuals. Those sort of concepts are also found in Greek myths and also found in the Bible. He mentioned that there could be a hall of records stored in our DNA, that we might have secrets in our own mind, and that eventually we are working towards evolving into being fully conscious beings. I've talked about consciousness a lot in this podcast, about how it's not a given, right? Like you've got to exercise consciousness. You've got to work towards it. I mentioned Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and they basically say the same thing. But these are all like, if you are at any point, any level, interested in anything that I've said right now, I would implore you to check out those two books. Just, with an open mind, just because I can, this is a short podcast relatively, and I can only kind of give you what kind of jumped out to me, but you may listen to these books and get something else out of it. But there are really some really interesting, elves and fairies aside, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, no, I shouldn't be dismissive of those aspects, because there's other things that he mentioned about how, for example, evidence that DMT could actually cause your brain to work more as a receiver, right? So right now our brain is a receiver, and it just kind of it picks up this reality, right? So it's transmitting this reality for our consciousness to experience. But then when you take certain illegal, I should say, just make note of that, but psychedelics and hallucinogens, it kind of reforms your brain, or it's like an adapter or whatever that like shifts, like it tunes the channel for you to perceive another reality. And, they say, like, for example, when you dream, DMT is in everything. It's in everybody. And so for some people, especially people who have like vivid dreams, something in your brain could be activating the DMT that's found naturally in your body, which then leads you to have, quote, dreams. But these dreams may very well be you experiencing, or your brain receiving, a transmission from an alternate reality. Humans exist on many levels, not just the level that we're in right now. And hallucinogens could be a means in which you can transfer your consciousness out of this particular dimension to, alternate dimensions. So all very, 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 at the very least, paradigm shifting, thought provoking stuff for sure. Moving on to the Immortality Key. The Immortality Key was less, I don't know what word I'm looking for, so I'm not going to do it. It was different in the sense of it's a different author. But what the Immortality Key focused on more was on the origins of religion. There's some words that he used that kind of make you raise an eyebrow, like witchcraft and witches and stuff like that. But to round it up and to just give a very brief synopsis, what he basically said was this. First things first, the basis of all religion on this planet, initially anyway, are hallucinogenic drugs. And it is through hallucinogenic drugs that mankind has been able to make contact with entities that people would describe as, quote, gods. And I don't mean gods in the sense of what Hancock talked about in Fingerprints of the Gods. I mean more gods in the sense of what people encounter, that feeling of, I guess I should say the true God, like our true understanding of God, the universe. When people say, you are God, they mean like a higher consciousness, not like a physical form or an advanced human being like a Thoth or a Ra or an Osiris, right? Where Hancock sort of theorizes that those entities were just human beings like us, and they came, to bring sort of their knowledge to other civilizations. What the Immortality talks about when it talks about gods are the collective consciousness, right? That experience you feel when you are connected, when you've meditated, when you feel that oneness with the world and the understanding that we are all one, that sort of thing. And essentially he said, he starts off with the premise of saying that, like, in order for people to become more religious, and not in like the the negative perception that it's become now, but more in spiritual, and have these spiritual encounters with all, encompassing all mind, I guess, for lack of better phrasing, is psychedelics. And then he goes through and he talks about like ancient practices, for one. Apparently in ancient Greeks, when they use the word, philosophy, and there's a quote by Socrates, a paraphrase, where he basically says to study philosophy is to learn to die. He basically says, Brian, the author, he basically says that concept of what we perceive of, or what we think of when we think of philosophy, is not just the study of books or the pursuit of wisdom. It's actually a practice through like an ancient ritual of imbibing hallucinogens, and then kind of going off, to meditate in like areas where there's like sensory deprivation. So whether it's a cave, mostly in caves. And the act is called incubation. So if you type in ancient incubation, you should find the ritual, or you could be able to read about the ritual on Wikipedia. And that was interesting. And when I was listening to that, it made me think of the beginning of Supernatural, where he discussed cave paintings of the surreal, right? Same thing. Like people would go into caves and paint, surreal entities. And I kind of wonder if, well, I'm going to link the two. If the ancient cave paintings, the reason why they occurred in caves is because people would the ancients would engage in the exercise of imbibing hallucinogens, and then, but intentionally doing so, that incubation, they would intentionally do so in the caves, and then they would draw what they saw, what they experienced right there in the cave, particularly as a message to, followers and to others to help facilitate their experiences, their psychedelic experiences as well. That was something interesting. And then he talks about how Dionysus, for example, which is a wine god, obviously, who turned water into wine, predated the Christian Jesus. And then the writer, John, the writer of the Gospel of John, had also intentionally, according to the author, made it like blended Dionysus with Jesus Christ in order to recruit followers of the cult of Dionysus. Now, an interesting point that he brought up that I'd never thought about before, because we tend to perceive history through our modern eyes, is that wine back then is not the same like wine that we think of when we drink wine or think of wine now. They would put herbs and sometimes lizards and frog parts and things like that. Like, it was meant not to get you drunk, but to cause you to hallucinate. And to some points, some people actually died. There was a book in the Bible where Paul actually discusses, in one translation, people actually dying from the consumption of wine at the Eucharist. And so what this author is trying to show the reader, and this is a relatively new book, he's mentioning COVID and the quarantine, so it must have just come out. But what he's trying to show you is that the first Eucharist, where, Christ says, eat my body and drink my blood, wasn't as random as we interpret it to be. That it's actually was an act. I forget what it's called. I think it's called that's a tongue tied. The act is called apotheosis, I believe. But it's the act of wanting to become like God. And the way you do this, the way you accomplish this, is by consuming the flesh of your God. So when Christ says, eat my flesh and drink my blood, he's saying essentially eat this hallucinogenic medicine or drug or mushroom, whatever. That's the flesh of God. And drink my blood, which is the hallucinogenic wine. That's the blood of God. And when you consume these things, it actually allows for you to perceive God and become like the one, like the higher consciousness, the over consciousness, the all-knowing, the all mind, so to speak. So that was essentially a different interpretation for sure than what I have ever heard of the Eucharist. And, the whole act of, consuming the body of Christ. I always obviously thought that was really weird, but through that interpretation, it actually does make a bit more sense, So you see certain things like, I found this book called Healing, Dream, and Ritual, Ancient Incubation and Modern Psychotherapy. That was an interesting sort of write-up. But there's another quote, from the direct quote from the book, the first Eucharist was psychedelic. Another direct quote from the book, to go down to the underworld when you're dead is one thing. To go down while you're alive, prepared unknowingly, and then learn from the experience is another thing entirely. Right? These sort of quotes, quote by Socrates, those who engage with philosophy, meditation in the right way are practicing nothing else but dying and being dead. Right? Another direct quote, waking is a form of consciousness. Dreaming is another. Essentially, it seems like the ancients really sort of knew what they were talking about when they made these sort of comparisons between communing with God and dying before you die. And when they talk about dying before you die, it's kind of the same sort of concepts that the Buddhists and the Hindus have written about, which is killing the ego and recognizing that you are not Bob or John or Smith or Kelly or whatever, that you are actually you are God experiencing all of reality through these different forms. So it definitely was an interesting read, because it took Christianity, or what we know to be Christianity, and gave it, like, once again, that Eastern philosophical twist to it. But then it also throws in hallucinogens as a way to experience, the all one, right? The collective consciousness. There you go. What we really should think of as God, not the bearded man looking down from us, but like a non-gendered entity that sort of is what we are, right? That, like the ocean and a drop of water are the same thing, right? So your soul, your spirit, whatever you want to call it, is a drop of water, and then God is essentially the ocean from which all these things stem. All these other, souls, consciousness stems. Religion wants to sort of twist that and say, no, there's this entity in the sky that's watching you, and you've got to, follow all these laws and the rules, or else you'll go to hell. But that's, of course, just another method in which to control people. There's a quote, self-knowledge is knowledge of God. Great quotes. Birth and death have no meaning. It's more a state of always being. So the idea that we never die, this is how the book kind of starts off. Another quote, consciousness survives bodily death. Another quote, ego is just an elaborate illusion. Another quote, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. Yeah. And all of these themes, right? Even Christ talks about rebirth, being born again, all of that, it's all, he links everything up to Eastern philosophy, and essentially says that psychedelics were used to facilitate that experience of killing the ego, leaving the body. And this is something that people experience every time they consume certain hallucinogens, right? They all report pretty much the same thing, that they feel like they're not really their body, that they don't die, that life is eternal, and they come back from these hallucinogenic experiences having what they would consider a spiritual experience, an experience that this world is an illusion, their ego is an illusion, and that when they die, that everything's still going to be okay because they'll keep going on. And how the book concludes is essentially that the Catholic Church started the war on drugs, and it was also they who led to the persecution of women, because in ancient times, women were also the ones who were the herbologists, who were making these, who were gathering the hallucinogenic, mushrooms and plants and all of that. And they offered, through these plants, women offered something that a male-dominated papacy, a male-dominated church couldn't, through the hallucinogens. He used the word, I forget what word he used to describe what you get at the church, which was just sort of more like a stand-in, a false promise of a communion with God. And he basically said that the ancients they used herbal medicine, plants, gases, even in the case of the Oracle of Delphi, as a way to commune with a higher level of consciousness, with the collective consciousness, with essentially, quote, God, right, if you want to use that term. And because the church couldn't obviously give people hallucinogenic drugs, right, and thus control that experience, they instead decided to just control the women and the people who did, pass out drugs, or not drugs, but the hallucinogenic plants, to the public, because those people challenged their authority, challenged their power. And so, yeah, that's how that ends. Insane, mind-blowing stuff. That, once again, it shifts your perception of reality slightly. I will say that I enjoyed that book, and I would definitely read it again. So, as I said in the beginning of the podcast, I did read 4 books this week, but because the 3 of them kind of tie in really nicely to each other, I will intentionally not talk about the 4th book that I did read, which I just finished today, which was called Your Brain is a Time Machine. That one has more to do with physics and science fiction, so I want to talk about this in like a different episode. Probably like I'll do another episode at the end of this week. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening, and thank you for your continued support to this podcast. It's been great watching the podcast grow through time. I will be doing more of these. I'm going to really focus on my reading, and then just passing the information on to you guys. Just I want to keep the topic, as thought-provoking as being the underlying theme. I know it kind of sidestepped last year into politics and things of that nature, but that's not something I'm necessarily passionate about. While it was warranted, all things considered, I do want to talk more about things that expand people's minds and make them think and make them more conscious. So thanks for being with me through this journey, and for continuing to listening, and I'm looking forward to more episodes. All right. Thanks for listening. Take care.